Do you like fantasy books but don't want to start a whole series because of it? I am much in the same position from time to time. I feel like I'm reading a series and I don't want to start a new one because what if I drop the old one that I'm reading? So I'm going to solve the problem for you and give you 5 recommendations for fantastic standalone fantasy books. These can either truly stand alone or be part of a wider universe, but not really require any reading prior or after, really. But if you decide to dive into this wider universe, that's an extra bonus. There's lots to chew on here, but if you like book reviews and just general videos on books, especially fantasy, don't forget to like and subscribe, and there will be plenty of more like this to come. So first of all, we have The Wrack by Bierce. This book is about, well, a pandemic. It was crazy because he released it in 2020 while everything was happening. It wasn't really planned, but it's crazy because that happened. And The Wrack is just a fantastic book. It almost reads like a collection of short stories where a pandemic actually hits this fantasy kingdom and they are just dealing with the consequences of it. I mean, there's all this stuff going on, all these people that are suffering, they're trying to find a reason, and the main character here almost feels like it is the Wrack. And it's just crazy, all these different things that are simultaneously happening, all the irrationality that people are going through, facing the Wrack. So yeah, I think it's something that, given the events of the start of this decade, we can all sort of relate to, really. And that's quite impressive that he could make such a fantasy book and collection of anecdotes and short stories within the context of a fantasy pandemic into something so relatable. And nowadays, now that we're a bit more removed from it, even though it's not entirely gone, we can sort of find it a maybe cozy read, I would call it. I think, especially because it does have just some notes of hope in it at the end of the day. Book number 2, it's this one. It's The Silmarillion by JRR Tolkien. Isn't that the author of The Lord of the Rings? Yes, you're dang right it is. You have The Lord of the Rings, but before that, you have thousands of years of history of this Middle-earth that Tolkien wrote. And this book, The Silmarillion, is all that. It's those thousands of years of history. It's basically the creation myth of Middle-earth. It's everything that happens in between, leading us to Lord of the Rings. I mean, there's a bunch of short stories here that are worthwhile. There's a bunch of tales of betrayal, of love, of tragedy, of heroism, honor, that I think are so well written. The characters are so amazing. I mean, even though it's told in an almost biblical way, you really want to keep reading. And it is a tough read. It really, truly does read like a Bible, but the stories are amazingly written. Tolkien was a master of his craft. You can truly see there the love he had for linguistics, all the family trees and the elvish families, and the way that everything develops there, the way the language develops there, the way that all the different races in Middle-earth came to be, came to exist, and came to coexist and interact throughout the years. It's crazy. Super worth it if you haven't considered it. The Silmarillion is absolutely worth a read. Next up is Never Die by Rob J. Hayes, and this is a stellar book. I mean, it's just such a satisfying read. It does read a little bit like a video game, which, depending on how much you like RPG games, it may or may not be your thing, but it's very much the structure of a hero that doesn't want to be the hero, then has a party, they're walking around collecting a party to do this mission that they're tasked with doing, in the context of them also being brought back to life and being unable to die. And they have to actually surmount these seemingly impossible odds in order to complete their mission and fulfill everything. And it honestly has one of the most satisfying endings in any book I've ever read. I was so satisfied reading that. I almost didn't want to pick another book up because the magic of it lingered for a while after finishing it. So Never Die by Rob J. Hayes is fantastic. It's standalone, and there's other books set in the same sort of universe that have some callbacks to it if you really want to keep reading further and if you really like his writing style. I personally did. I personally kept reading further into other stories which are completely different but also completely worthwhile. Next up, we'll go a little sci-fi here with The Long Way to a Small Angry Planet by Becky Chambers. The reason I think this book is awesome is because not only did Becky Chambers create a sci-fi world, but she really cares about the creation of cultures, traditions, and interactions between different species of aliens. So what would that look like? What would that look like if humans had to learn a little bit about a different species of alien? And that alien is explaining their culture, that alien is explaining their customs, and then they sit down to eat, and that alien has to explain how they eat, how their traditions are and their manners are around the dinner table and all of that stuff. Even some hints at what romance would look like between a human and certain different alien species. So it really cares about building those cultures and those traditions. And I think it's put so much care into it. I can't help but be charmed by it. And combine that with a very, very cool crew of characters and a really good sense of humor in general in the book. And I think you have something really, really special that to me is super worthwhile. There's also talk of a wider universe here that you're not as concerned of because this is more about the characters, about the world building, about the alien traditions and cultures. If you want to read that, if that sounds super interesting, that is definitely the book for you, because I at first was sort of undecided on what this book wanted to be, and then I realized what it actually was, and I got so into it. I wasn't expecting it, but I loved it. Next up, I'm going to give a shout out to just Discworld in general. I mean, there are so many Discworld books that you can probably just pick up, read, and that's it. You don't need to really follow it up with other books, while other Discworld books are actually a series. I think the best standalone Discworld books are going to be Small Gods, which sort of pokes a lot of fun at religion, talks about how ridiculous some of these situations are within Discworld. I think it's just such a hilarious read from beginning to end. It's not too long either, so you can finish it very quickly if you just read a little bit of it every day. It's just such a fun introduction to the world, to the characters. It's so charming, it's so funny, to the point that I've heard even religious and non-religious people praise this book a lot for just having so much relatability to it in the way that it pokes fun at religion. And likewise, there's also Pyramids that makes fun of ancient Egyptian culture and some of the ridiculousness of it. I think it just talks about some of those things and points out just how ridiculous it is in the context of Discworld. I think it's very fun. And there's also Moving Pictures, which is basically like this fantasy world in Discworld discovers Hollywood, discovers movies, and they're having their little industrial revolution and their little Hollywood there. So those are three really fun books that are standalone stories there that you can read that I would thoroughly recommend, because I had lots of fun with all of them. But those were honorable mentions. My actual fifth book that I'm going to mention is actually a short story compilation. I think more of those should be given the time of day and be read. And this one's called Strange Economics. Strange Economics is fantastic. It's a collection of speculative fiction that has something to do with economics. And I think that is so fun because it can vary as much as just what a dragon does with his gold as what mages would do to modify monetary policy. It really scratches this geeky part of my brain that also loves finance, economics, accounting. And if you really like that combination of money and fantasy and just seeing how that would interact and seeing all the different ideas all these different authors have, this is fantastic. I think it's a great way to just put those little ideas, those little feelings, those little changes that fantasy and economics would interact in, and just put a lot of them in a book, and you have a super enjoyable collection. I honestly read this a few years ago and still think about many of the stories that I read in it. So that does it for my recommendations, but please tell me about any great fantasy standalones that you have read, or even sci-fi, because I think in general people would be interested in reading more standalones, and especially if there's a wider universe, because you can try it, you can realize if this is for you or not, if you really like the author's writing or not, and if you want to keep going from there in this wider universe that they're writing. And that's just so cool, right? That we can read quite a few short stories by the same author, or short books that maybe aren't necessarily directly connected, but do have some wider callbacks. I think that's very satisfying when that happens. So make sure to check out the books I mentioned and mention the books you like down below in the comments. And with that said, I thank you so much for watching all the way to here. I really appreciate it, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.